So I wrote a column, posted it on BillO'Reilly.com, filed it on Saturday, called The Rebellion. So there are 8 states that are rebelling against the federal government's immigration law. I will list them in a moment, okay? And what does that mean? It just means they refuse to obey the law. That's a rebellion. This is the sanctuary city movement, but it's more than that. Okay, so on Saturday, you saw one of those states, Minnesota, host a demonstration against the ICE shooting of last week. A couple of thousand people showed up, and there's nothing wrong with people protesting. That's what we do in America when we don't think something is wrong. But this protest was sponsored by a far-left group called the Minnesota Immigration Rights and Action Committee. This was an ideological protest, not an organic protest, okay? It was organized exclusively by the far left to seek people's presence on the far left. That's what this was all about. Okay. Authorities in Minneapolis arrested 29 people, and they were throwing chunks of ice and other debris at the local cops. Feds had no presence here. It's a local demonstration, all right? And one police officer was hurt. That's the who, what, when, where, and why of the rally. The people who attended the rally are in one category. They are leftists who hate the Trump administration. Roll the tape.
It was another instance of someone in our city being killed, being murdered by law enforcement, and I'm ready to be done with it.
I love my community, I love my city, and I hate what's happening to it with people who frankly aren't from here coming in and telling us who should be here. And when it comes down to loving my neighbor, I'm just gonna love my neighbor.
Here's ICE riding through our neighborhoods, destroying families, destroying businesses, tearing our communities apart, and they're not being held accountable. And that's why we're here. We're out here to demonstrate, to try to hold them accountable.
Okay, fine. But that's not what really that is. That is an open border. We don't want any law enforcement to confront undocumented migrants. We don't want it. You let them in, they do what they want. That's what these people stand for, but they're never honest about it. That shouldn't be a surprise. 75 million people voted for Kamala Harris, who supported President Biden's open border policy and didn't want any law enforcement against people, foreign nationals, who came into the country illegally. Kamala Harris wouldn't have done anything. Would have continued on the open border and let people just wave on it. Okay? 75 million Americans voted for her. A lot of folks. So of course you're going to have that. Now, the 8 states in open rebellion are these: California, Oregon, Washington State, Colorado, Minnesota, Illinois, Massachusetts, and New Jersey. New York and Vermont are right on the edge there. I don't have them on there because there's a dialogue, at least, going on with Washington, but you can put them on there. And when you have 10 states, it's basically telling the federal government, we're not going to obey your law. You have what they had before the Civil War. It's exactly the same thing. And I make the point in the column that from 1830 to 1860, 30 years, Southern states said, we're not going to obey whatever you say. And we're not just talking slavery, we're talking tariffs, we're talking almost everything. Andrew Jackson slapped them down, okay? But then we had a series of weak presidents like Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan who let the South rise in ferocity. And then we had the Civil War. That was a rebellion against the federal government. Only other time in our history we've seen this was during the Vietnam War. But that was a populist uprising. Started out ideological, but then the war got out of control because of Lyndon Johnson's incompetency and deceit. And the American people, and that just cut across almost every barrier, said enough of this. And the demonstrations happened. And violence happened. Kent State, National Guard, and a lot of other areas. Now, the federal government at this point has a couple of obligations. Has to enforce the law. Has to. But they can de-escalate violent confrontations. So if ICE agents see that there's a person like Ms. Good impeding their investigation with an automobile, the vehicle, then you de-escalate that. You arrest her later, which they could have done easily. All right? You don't up it, because if there's a lot more violence, then the Trump administration is going to lose the country. It's going to. You got to de-escalate in any kind of potential violent situation. Now, that doesn't mean if the ICE agents are attacked that they can't fight back. They should fight back. I'm not saying that. But if you can lessen potential violence, you have to do that. And that's not just me saying it, that's every law enforcement agency in the country has that in their manual. Okay, if you don't have to use lethal force, you don't. Get it later. Do it later. Now, that's number one. Number two, 77 million Americans voted for Donald Trump. And that vote needs to be respected. It's not respected by the left. Okay, it's not. And it's probably a vice versa on that too. But when 77 million Americans say we want immigration law enforced, you got to enforce it. The Trump administration is not doing anything wrong theoretically. Okay? But the ICE commanders have got to know that there's a volatile situation. Because if it gets worse, the Democrats are going to win the midterms. And they're making their stand not on the economy now, because the economy is pretty good. They're making their stand on this. This is the hill they're standing on, illegal immigration. I think that's foolish. I believe most Americans see this Minnesota stuff for what it is, a provocation of the federal government, a rebellion against social order. I believe most of us see that. And the Democratic Party is standing opposed to that. It's going to hurt them, particularly because it's a weak party with no leader. But if you are calling ICE Gestapo and you are supporting open borders and no supervision of foreign nationals, and you won't even cooperate in the 10 states that I mentioned with criminal migrant investigations, you wouldn't even cooperate then, America's going to walk away from you, in my opinion. Summing up, the federal government has to enforce immigration law, but it has to be done a little bit differently now. Situation is just too volatile. We don't want dead people. Yeah. But we do want people held accountable. And that's a memo.